All right, good evening. Welcome to the program. You're listening to the Soapbox on WMPG. My name is Eric Poulin, and I thank you kindly for being here and joining the conversation tonight. The conversation began a couple episodes ago, and we'll kind of get into that. But first, I'd like to introduce my guest. Frank Carlson is joining me this evening on the phone. He is a lawyer, and he's been practicing criminal defense and civil rights law in the St. Louis area for 38 years now. Welcome to the show, Frank.
Hi, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So as I mentioned, first of all, I should mention to listeners, feel free to join this conversation. If you're listening in the state of Maine, the phone number is 780-4909. If you're outside of the state of Maine, just add 207-780-4909. And this is your Soapbox as well. This is community radio, and we share the airwaves with you. We'd like to hear your thoughts. So, Frank, I asked you on the show tonight for a few reasons. One, I know you're from St. Louis, and that is relatively near Ferguson. I know that you're a civil rights lawyer, so I thought you might have an interesting perspective. And like so many of us, I've witnessed on Facebook that you've clearly had a visceral, emotional reaction to what has been taking place in Ferguson. And I'd like to start by going back to we've been sort of touching on this topic on the Soapbox for a few episodes now. We began when Chris Hedges was on the show, and he talked about how Hannah Arendt talked in The Origins of Totalitarianism about the dangers of an omnipotent police force, a police force that feels and is able to essentially do whatever it wants, to whomever it wants, whenever it wants. And so maybe we can start there. And as a criminal defense lawyer, as a civil rights lawyer, do you feel that in America we are beginning to have what Hannah Arendt may have called an omnipotent police force?
Well, St. Louis County, which surrounds the city of St. Louis, and the city of St. Louis is a separate county unto its own. St. Louis County is broken up into a huge number of municipalities, some relatively large and some very, very small, and I mean in the hundreds of for population. And over the last 20 plus years, I've been watching all these little police departments acquire SWAT vehicles, retired military vehicles, armored vehicles, enormous caches of weaponry of a military type. And it used to be kind of amusing to drive through, let's say, Eureka, Missouri, which is on the far western end of St. Louis County and is pretty rural, just the edge of suburban sprawl. It used to be amusing to drive by and see their SWAT vehicle, sort of like Barney Fife's One Bullet. It was unfunny watching all of these military vehicles from the various municipalities descend upon Ferguson. Mm. You saw the Al Jazeera truck that got tear gassed by the police just because they were videoing the police. Mm-hmm. There was a local network affiliate with a video camera that videoed the Al Jazeera crew having to flee their camera and light setup and run off with their faces covered away from the tear gas. And then an armored vehicle rolled up, and it said St. Charles SWAT. St. Charles is another county away and is at least 30 miles from Ferguson. So they brought military vehicles in from all of these municipalities, and they had an army in Ferguson, which is just a little inner ring suburb. Very nice little town is what Ferguson is.
So let's jump back even a bit further, and perhaps you can explain to my listeners your connection and relationship to Ferguson. Have you been to Ferguson? What is your experience of Ferguson?
My teenage years, I lived with my family in Hazelwood, which is basically a one school district over. Hazelwood School District and the Ferguson Florissant School District were great rivals in athletic contests and everything else. And so, sure, we were in Ferguson all the time. And it's very disturbing to see it misunderstood on press accounts. See it characterized as a small town. It's not a small town. It's an inner suburb of St. Louis that suddenly has shifted demographically to a very heavily majority black population. And I mean within less than a decade this change has come about. And people need to understand that the St. Louis area has had a decades-long history of trouble with the real estate and banking industries, with redlining and steering. And you could just watch over time the white flight from the city of St. Louis, the north side of the city of St. Louis, into North St. Louis County, followed by upwardly mobile blacks into North St. Louis County, with renewed white flight now to another county away, St. Charles County, continuing a northern path, and now upwardly mobile African-American families in St. Louis County are moving, like to buy new houses too, and they're moving into St. Charles County, and now the white people are moving to Warren County, yet another county away. It's this pattern of creating ghettos is a technically correct word, but it creates the wrong image because Ferguson ain't no ghetto.
So what would you say to, I mean, I think there's been sort of a backlash from conservative circles that suggests that, you know, liberals are sort of turning this into a quote-unquote race issue when it is not necessarily that. What is your sense of, is this a race issue, or has this been blown out of proportion?
It is a race issue. It's a police issue that goes beyond race, but it's this overlay of what we've seen is a police attitude of being of the people that they're supposed to serve as being others. That I work a lot in rural areas, so I see a lot of police agencies that apply these same attitudes towards whomever they're dealing with. There's a superiority and detachment, and when you add that to the overlay of racism that is just really heavy in St. Louis. St. Louis used to be referred to as Up South. That combination is what we saw explode in Ferguson.
So last week, we actually had on a law enforcement officer here on the Soapbox, and he's an interesting fellow. His name is Alex. He wishes to remain anonymous so that he can speak freely. He is in law enforcement, but he's also a socialist, self-identified socialist. He's also an activist. And he said a few things that sort of struck me and some listeners. One, he was critical of Officer Wilson's response to the situation, even though we don't know all of the exact details. But he said even granting the story that Officer Wilson has proffered to explain what happened, there were better responses. He basically said in police circles they have what they call a good shoot, which is a justified use of force. And he said that this did not, to his ears, sound like a good shoot. For example, Officer Wilson, if Michael Brown was reaching into his car, could have stepped on the gas and pulled away, or removed himself from that situation without the use of force. And of course, we have the autopsy, which shows 6 shots, at least one in the back, which to me seems to imply that he was shot while he was running away, turned around, put his hands up, got shot in the head, which ultimately killed him. But one thing that Alex said that kind of made my jaw drop was he said that within police circles, within their own group, that they tell each other essentially when they're coming up that if something goes wrong, the story you use is they were going for your gun. And apparently that's pretty much accepted as, okay, if something happens, that's what you do. What is your sense of where have the police gone wrong? I mean, they do serve an important purpose to society, right? Or do they?
Well, it's interesting what Officer Alex said. I obviously know nothing about Officer Alex, but it's stunning to me to hear a cop admit that. My belief is that the problem lies in the police academies. I don't know what's being taught there. I often wish I'd gone to a police academy. Missouri and perhaps all states have mandatory, what's referred to as post-certification police officer safety training, a mandatory minimum number of hours of police academy that must be attended, and there's only a very small number of police academies, and it's not well known what gets taught there. And if that's what gets taught there, I cannot say I'm surprised that it is. I'm merely surprised to hear it said out loud by a police officer.
Mm-hmm. Alex was pretty candid, and he said that based on what he was seeing in the news coverage of Ferguson, that for example, like I mentioned, that people in the military have been critical when the militarization of the police is the phrase is used, because they say, look, in the military, you're trained to not raise your weapon at someone unless you're prepared to kill them. And Alex jumped in and he said, look, that's how it is with police too. You're taught that from the beginning. And so when you see an entire police force in Ferguson walking around town with their weapons raised, now whether they have rubber bullets in there or not, that's
a command directive. That was one of the more troubling and disappointing developments in Ferguson for me, was that John Belmar, who heads the St. Louis County Police Department, my understanding was that he was in command of the police response in Ferguson, not Tom Jackson, the incompetent chief of police in Ferguson. And the tactics that got deployed were therefore deployed on Belmar's command. Now, St. Louis County has such a history of balkanization into little tiny municipalities, and some big ones too, with such terrible police departments that have been sued over and over and over and over for police abuse of force and for the operation of their jails, that some of the towns have in fact voluntarily, belatedly disbanded their police departments and contracted out their law enforcement authority to the St. Louis County Police Department. And I have seen in the towns where that has been done, Valley Park, Fenton, Jennings, there's more, that the problems of horrible police work have been deeply diminished. But now we see that Belmar responds in the manner that he does, and so now I have concerns about the competency of the St. Louis County Police Department, which likes to have the words internationally accredited stenciled all over their police cars.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to The Soapbox. My name is Eric Poulin. Thank you for joining me. My guest this evening is civil rights and criminal defense lawyer Frank Carlson, and he's been practicing law in the St. Louis area for 38 years and has been following the events of Ferguson closely, like many of us. And you're welcome to join the conversation. Please do. Area code 207-780-4909. So, Frank, I'm not sure if you can really answer this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What is your sense? Is this in terms of the the ferocity of the response of the police force in Ferguson. Is that a problem that is unique to that area, or do you sense that this is a problem across the country?
Well, I don't. I guess the honest answer is I don't know, but I can't see why this might not happen again someplace else. I was rather surprised at the muted response in New York City to the chokehold death that we recently saw there. Mm-hmm. Maybe the best thing that comes out of this is that other law enforcement heads in other places take what St. Louis County did, what Ferguson did, but really the response blame falls on St. Louis County and John Belmar. Mm-hmm. We'll see what was done here as a primer on what not to do.
And there was also that the shooting death, I believe, in St. Louis of a young black man just last week or week and a half ago.
Yes, and while the police were still on the street in Ferguson,
right,
in force, and the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, whom I have personally sued repeatedly over the years, mm-hmm. Immediately got on the news and made a statement about what the officers' version of the events was, and vowed transparency. Shortly after that, a cell phone video of the shooting from beginning to end popped up. And it appears to me to thoroughly discredit the statement the St. Louis Metropolitan Police released as the shooting officer's version of the events. It was the St. Louis Police Department that released that video.
The St. Louis Police Department released...
And it's that kind of transparency that is the most important thing to do in these situations.
We should clarify. I'm very sorry. I don't know the victim's name, but he appeared to be mentally unstable. He was holding a knife, and then he was pleading with the cops to shoot him, telling them, shoot me now. And they did. They shot him many times. They shot him even after he was on the ground, motionless. They continued to fire at him. I have not watched the video. I'm not sure that I have the stomach for that sort of thing, but is that a pretty fair assessment? I mean, transparency is good, Frank, right? But that's an incident that very likely could have been de-escalated without the loss of life.
Oh, yes. I'm only talking about the response to the shooting by the police department, by immediately speaking publicly about what witnesses had to say. The only witnesses at that time were the cops, and then voluntarily putting this video out there. No, the shooting itself was ridiculous. It's apparently well known in the young man's neighborhood that he's mentally challenged, and you can see him in the video. He has taken 2 bottles of soda and set them on the curb. And he's just pacing back and forth on the sidewalk alongside them when the SUV with a couple of white cops rolls up, and they get out, and this man begins walking towards them, and they just start shooting.
Yeah.
If the police got out of their SUVs and walked around and talked to people, they would know that this guy had problems, and that everyone in the neighborhood forgave his strange behaviors. But they were afraid of him because he's the other.
Yeah, and frankly, had they not gotten out of their vehicles, my understanding is that there was no one in immediate danger around.
There was no one in immediate danger.
And so they could have remained in their vehicle, remained safe, taking care of themselves, while attempting to de-escalate the situation. I mean, my sense is I want to be very careful here because I know people in law enforcement, and there are good people in law enforcement, and they are doing an extraordinarily difficult job. I respect that. I acknowledge that. But I think that there is a culture that has sort of taken root in law enforcement that is deeply problematic.
Yes.
And I think, like you say, law enforcement treats civilians as the enemy. I mean, I read an essay.
Well, that's why I used the term othering.
Right.
Because yes, we are someone other than them, and we are someone other than police. And for Michael Brown, the young man that the St. Louis police killed a few days later, was named Kajami Powell.
Okay.
They were especially other because they were black.
Right. You know, and the thing that strikes me, Frank, is that the police's motto, their job is supposedly to protect and serve, but it stops there, right? I mean, it's assumed that they're there to protect and serve us, citizens. That's supposed to be what they're doing, right? But if you listen to law enforcement talk, even Alex, who's relatively enlightened and progressive, the first people that they talk about protecting and serving are their fellow cops.
Well, look, the city of Ferguson, which is not one of the most egregious night court bilking operations in St. Louis County. There are worse ones up the road. Calverton Park is one, up Florissant Avenue. Mm-hmm. Ferguson is not the worst, but with 52 cops, Ferguson Municipal Court last year took in $2.5 million in fees and fines. The cops in places like that, the police departments and the municipal court, they're like a perpetual motion machine once they get going, and their sole purpose is to fund themselves.
Is anyone making money off of that perpetual motion machine?
Sure. Everybody on the board in Ferguson, every police officer in Ferguson.
So I just want to, before we get to a caller, we do have a caller on the air, but before we get there, I do want to be clear. I mean, I know I'm sounding very harsh and very critical of law enforcement, and I'm reluctant to come across too strongly in that direction. I want to be very specific. What I'm concerned about is that culture and the seemingly quick trigger to resorting to violence in response to situations. I understand it's complicated, and law enforcement officers are human, and they do need to protect themselves, and they need to protect their fellow officers in order to help protect the citizens. I think that's how they prioritize it. But okay. I am.
And then when they get sued for excessive use of force, they come to court with expert witnesses who testify to things like this. I actually saw a police expert witness testify to this in federal court in St. Louis in one of my cases a couple of years ago, that if a police officer saw that an old granny had a couple of pot plants in clay pots on her window ledge, they would be justified in an elevated use of force because she's a drug-involved individual.
Yeah, see, that doesn't make any sense to me. But okay, let's jump to the caller. Caller, you are on the air with Frank Carlson. My name is Eric Poulin. You're listening to the Soapbox. Please state your first name and where you're calling from, and go ahead.
Yeah, Frank, he didn't want to come on the air, but he did have a question.
Okay.
Frank, I guess the question is, and maybe you both can answer it, how do we stop the militarization of the police departments, not only here in Portland, but around America?
You only do that at the ballot box, and that's a very slow and difficult process.
So what is the short-term reaction, Frank? What do you think? Do we need more people to take to the streets? Why has the reaction died down already so quickly?
Yeah, it is. It is sad. Well, look, the reaction hasn't died down completely. We're talking to each other. It's still a hot topic around the St. Louis area. It's not a daily news feature because the police aren't out there inciting riots anymore.
Mm-hmm. To their credit, right?
Belatedly, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, I do get the sense, though, that I wonder what it's going.
Here's the thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
How much do we spend on our military?
Right.
They give away their used stuff so they can buy new stuff.
Right.
It's what President Eisenhower said. The military-industrial complex, which now is highly part of the political process, is a threat to our individual civil liberties. I don't think that when he said that, anyone envisioned what we saw in Ferguson, but there it is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's there in every metropolitan area.
And I think, tell me if you agree with me, Frank, but I think that the problem is much broader. I mean, broader than just problems in law enforcement. I mean, look at our gun culture and the gun laws in this country. And I actually have some sympathy if you're an officer and you're on the street attempting to, maintain order and peace during a riot and things get heated. You don't know who has a gun. You don't know who's carrying.
Correct.
What's that?
That's correct. A few days ago, Iceland had a national day of mourning because a police officer killed a citizen for the first time in their country's history. I don't think they have the proliferation of guns that we have. No, there is some legitimacy to police fear that the people they're confronting are armed. But you don't get to shoot someone to death and then find out if they're armed. And if you don't have the backbone to wait to find out whether lethal force is necessary before you use it, then you have to quit and get a job where it doesn't require so much courage.
That's right. I have to agree. I mean, I think some of my listeners may know I'm a special education teacher, and I work with pretty low-functioning, high-need students, some of which are extraordinarily aggressive. All right. Mm-hmm. And my reaction when a student, now I've had my shirt torn off my body. I've been clawed. I've been beaten. I've been spat on. I've been bitten. Dangerous things. My reaction when someone is coming at me is to engage de-escalation strategies that I have been taught. Obviously, I'm not going to respond with force. Now, I don't see why the police couldn't use similar de-escalation strategies up to a point, and then of course sometimes force is required, but up to a point which I don't think that police have been observing a reasonable level of de-escalation, or a reasonable place to put that line of de-escalation strategies.
You mean you don't taser your students immediately?
No, and I'm afraid we have about 20 seconds left, so I'll give you the last comment, Frank.
Oh, honestly, I think it's a credit. It's to the credit of the people of Ferguson that they rose up the way that they did. Mm-hmm. It shows their level of intelligence and awareness, and I was, in a sense, heartened to see them do what they did. Mm-hmm. Congratulations to them.
We are in agreement there. Thank you so much, Frank Carlson, for being here this evening.
Thank you.
And thank you for tuning in. Thank you to Jim for filling in for Michael this week, engineering. You've been listening to The Soapbox. My name is Eric Poulin. You can find all of our previous episodes on YouTube. We have a Soapbox channel. And you can also find The Soapbox on Facebook, facebook.com/The Soapbox Portland. And that's it for me. Stick around for Night on Earth with Byron. And did I get the name of the show wrong? Okay, good. I got it right. All right. My name is Eric. Have a wonderful evening. Thanks.
That's why I say that it ain't. It ain't.